The Australian Curriculum Studies Association would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and the waterways from where we are all meeting today. We pay our respects to the elders past and present, and we extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We value the contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to education and their continued support of the teaching and learning of all Australians. We recognise that for thousands of years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been the first teachers, and that we are committed to continue our learning alongside them.
Welcome back, everyone, to this next in our series of AXA Insight podcasts. Now, this month, we are having a focus on instruction, specifically the instruction and action in our classrooms. Now, the topic is always hotly debated, and we often hear the terms evidence-based or data-informed in more of a sales pitch towards schools rather than recognition of the strong academic work that lies behind it. Now, one person who has undertaken a considerable amount of academic research in this field is Dr Kathy Gibbs. Good morning and welcome, Kathy.
Hello, Anna. Thanks for having me.
Dr Kathy Gibbs is a senior lecturer at Griffith University in Queensland. And not only does she hold numerous degrees, including a doctorate in education, but she's also completed postgraduate work in the areas of psychology and adolescent health and welfare. Now, Kathy really does then have that holistic approach and background to education. The wealth of her research is in differentiated instruction as a teaching pedagogy that is suitable for all students. Now, let's kick it off with one that's quite a personal question, but really helps us understand what and where you've got to in your personal journey so far. But can you tell us just a little bit more about your own journey into education?
Sure. Well, it started in the mid 70s when I finished year 12. And back in those days, Anna, most girls left school in year 10 and went off to secretarial college. So fortunately for me, I was given the opportunity to do year 11 and 12.
Yeah.
But still, career paths for women in those days were fairly restrictive to things like nursing and teaching. And way back in the day, in the 70s, when Gough Whitlam was the Prime Minister of Australia, they had Commonwealth scholarships for teachers. So I applied for one, was indeed fortunate enough to receive one. And so I was paid to go to Teachers College, for a better word, in Sydney every day, and got a diploma in teaching, secondary home economics, so textiles and design and food science. And from there, improved my education standards by doing a degree, master's, grad certs, and I've taught in a number of schools in both Queensland, Southern Queensland and Northern New South Wales. So up until 9 years ago, finished my ed doc in 2014 and have now moved from P to 12 schools to teaching adults, undergrad, postgrad in education. So that's my journey.
Wow, that's quite a journey. And even just understanding that dynamic of where we've come in a period of time, just, kind of how people perceive and look at women in the workplace as being quite as significant. And, we hope that does continue because we've got a way to go, but we're certainly in a much better place than we used to be, definitely. Now, we're sort of sometimes in an the educational climate can be a little bit confusing at the moment because the conversation regarding instruction is a hot one. And often it's been, we look at it sometimes used politically or whatever it is with the new governments or whatever might be happening. But we have many schools currently advocating for direct instruction, which is often misled into explicit instruction. And then there are often other schools that are claiming to address critical and creative learning skills and what are deemed as 21st century skills. And they do it through a lens of inquiry learning. But we know that these different pedagogical approaches are often held against each other in these polarizing opinions. Now, you've conducted lots of research into the needs of students, and your work has found to be some of the most effective ways at supporting all students. But is there, say, a one-way approach that might fit everyone?
Definitely not.
Wonderful. That's what I want to hear.
But I think and I can only speak on my own teaching experience. So, and I taught for 35 years in schools before moving into academia and becoming an academic. And look, I'm going to put my hand up and say I was one of those teachers who taught to the middle.
Yeah.
And I still think, and I can't, confirm this because I'm not in schools per se these days, but I do a lot of research in schools, and I still think that there are a number of teachers who do teach to that middle group. We've also got to understand too that the average age of our teachers is around 45 to 48.
Yeah.
So the learning that they had at university didn't include specific instruction or teaching, high quality teaching strategies such as differentiated instruction or explicit teaching. And I do not recall myself in the 70s being exposed to that sort of learning either. And so, for me, and I can only speak for myself, you're picking up the skills as you go. You're increasing your confidence the longer that you're in the classroom. You're adapting teaching strategies and skills that you're confident in using, and do so. Yeah. And for me, I did teach to that middle group, and anyone who didn't pass their assignments or exams was not my fault. It was the fault of the child because they weren't focusing, they weren't engaged in my learning. That is not 21st century teaching now, because our classrooms, and they always were diverse, but we just didn't have that learning about the diversity in our classrooms either. Whereas we are very well aware, due to our national policy documents and our state legislation too, that advocates for inclusive education, where it is a requirement and an expectation that every teacher is able to accommodate for and teach to the diversity in their classroom.
Definitely. I love what you picked up on that, because I always reflect on this, because I graduated in 2000s and very early. And I remember doing English, and we were taught two methods, the top down and the bottom up approach for reading. And I thought I knew it all. I left and I was like, well, I've done my degree and I've been taught how to be a teacher. That ongoing learning for me wasn't really something that I'd even thought about. I thought you got your degree, you went into your job, boom, you're done. And that was quite a reality shock, I think, actually, realizing that I still have to go to all these PDs. But it was only when I started to understand the role, I recognized the value of doing that, because, as you're saying, you're not just teaching that middle band. Like, there were some children that just didn't respond to the way I was teaching, and I had to kind of put my head around that. So I think that's a very common thing. And I think that's quite difficult to explain to graduate teachers, that your learning hasn't stopped. I know you've got that certificate, but my goodness, this is only the start of really where you're going to go next. Now, differentiated instruction is the core of your research. Now, this theory has often been associated with the work of Carol Ann Tomlinson, and I particularly like to quote that she said, teachers can begin to differentiate instruction simply by learning more about their students and trying to tailor their teaching as much as they find feasible. Now, this resonates with me because it really is that child is front and center of what you're looking at doing, and alludes to the fact that the relationships are the key part. But effective implementation of differentiated instruction obviously needs a really strong support in a school that allows for that continuous professional learning, as we sort of alluded to. And I presume quite a lot of reflection on the practice. It's obviously rather complex in an approach, but what do you see as some of the barriers that really do hinder its implementation effectively?
Oh, there are a number of barriers.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when I interview teachers across, whether it be metropolitan school or a rural school, those barriers seem to be very similar.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yes, one of the biggest barriers, and a lot of my research has focused particularly on secondary school teachers. I'm now merging into and speaking with primary. And the primary school teachers, their barriers are quite different to the secondary school barriers. If I want to take a leap of faith. I think primary school teachers are much better at differentiating instruction, and I think one of the reasons why is, Anna, exactly what you said when you introduced this question. They know their students really well,
yes,
because they have them every day for the entire year. Whereas a secondary school teacher has their students maybe for an hour and a half a week, and they teach a vast number of students, not 25 students only. So we've got different barriers for different school contexts. But the biggest barrier that I'm aware of is lack of time.
Yes.
Because teachers do not get a great deal of pre-planning time. And that pre-planning phase where you're writing your lesson plans, you're looking at the diversity in your classroom, you are looking at the content that you're teaching for that lesson, and you need time to be able to match all those together so that you're creating an effective lesson where you're engaging all your students and they're learning at the same time. So that pre-planning phase to me is really vital.
Yes.
And you need time to do that. So time is a big barrier. Administrative constraints too are a big barrier, where you've got the timetable is so regimented, especially in secondary schools where teachers have only got a certain amount of time in the lesson before the student moves off to another class.
Yeah.
And the curriculum is so condensed that we've got to get through this work. And if you're left behind, sure, I'll have to do something about that. But for the moment, we've got to keep moving. So there's that sort of pressure too. And also, I think one of the other common, and I'm trying to talk about very common barriers here, is limited resources for teachers in their school. So I was speaking to some teachers at one school, and I know that we're trying to be more sustainable, but students, not having a computer in the classroom, not having the textbook to use, those sort of resources that are necessary at times are absent in certain classrooms, and that makes teaching very tricky.
Yes, unbelievably. I remember speaking to a young person the other day about, just getting a bit of a perspective from young people. And they said, we don't think our teacher knows our name. And this was after a period of time. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, they just, when they've marked the work, they just put it on the table and say, go and grab your work. And I was a bit heartbroken because I thought, at first you go, the teacher doesn't know. But then, I kind of look them up and they do all of these different things and they're always very busy and they've got another 8-hour group they've been told to take on. And it just made me realize that sometimes as well, our teaching workforce now, they're having to be this master of all trades. And there isn't that ability to just hone in on that really important bit because they're being dragged into this sort of, or can you cover this or can you cover that? And it's actually, in the long term, we're not producing that kind of workforce that really is core. I think there's a lot of that coming in. And I think you're right, especially in that secondary environment where it's so siloed. And we try really hard to break those silos down. But unfortunately, the way the system is still set up, we're in that kind of stage. You're right. Now, Caroline Tomlinson is from the US, but we do know that this theory of differentiated instruction was taken on quite well in the UK. And it's often known, I think we've discussed before, by its acronym DI, which, I was the mistake. I thought that was direct instruction because all of these acronyms are used so interchangeably. Now, we're seeing AITSL, New South Wales, Victoria, if we have a quick Google search, they use the word differentiated in different contexts. And I have to say, I couldn't really nail the jelly to the wall and find out what the universal definition or adoption was. But I suppose from your experience, without this clarity, what is the impact on implementation?
Well, a lot of confusion. And I think I probably need to go back a couple of steps. Differentiated instruction is very complex.
Yes.
And yes, Caroline Tomlinson is an expert in the field.
Yeah.
And she has developed her model or her framework of differentiated instruction over a couple of decades. So if you have a look at her work around 1999, she was writing about thinking about differentiated instruction. From there to her 2014 work, she's now created a model or a framework of differentiated instruction. And when you look at it, it really is quite complex.
Yes.
But she's able to, talk it through. And I think the key for teachers is to not feel that you have to be differentiating instruction every day, every lesson across those 4 key curriculum areas, which are content, process, product, and the environment. And I think that's where some of our teachers may get caught up in that complexity that they need to be doing all 4 of those and then gathering the student data, knowing what the student's interest is as well. And all that takes time. So I don't even know where I'm going. I'm getting a little bit lost. But I think that what makes it so complex and confusing too is depending upon what state in Australia and what university our pre-service teachers are attending, this term can, we see it in policy documents as one thing, we see it on Department of Education websites as another, differentiated learning, differentiated teaching, differentiated instruction. 8th Standard 1.5, I think, uses the term differentiated or differentiated learning. I'm not 100% sure. So there's this massive confusion because we don't have this universal term. However, I want to go back to Caroline Tomlinson and make the point that, and a lot of our university lecturers do teach that model to our students. However, the terminology that she uses in her model are not terms that we use in Australia. She uses the term product, where we use formative and summative assessment. Or task. So I think it's really crucial that Australia develops its own model of differentiated instruction. And if that can happen, and I'm just going to names drop here, 2 colleagues that I'm working with, Dr. Tom Porter at the University of Adelaide and Dr. Gemma Scarapolo at the University of WA, the 3 of us are planning on, towards the end of the year, we've set up a 2-day workshop where we're meeting together and we're going to design an Australian model of differentiated instruction. And then hopefully it might escalate and take some sort of shape. And I think that's a really important thing to do because Australia needs its own model rather than be adopting a model that is utilised in the US, for example.
Yes. Oh, 100%. I think that's a really good point because I do harp on a lot about context, and I always think that we adopt things from other places without their understanding of our context, with that kind of view that they've had success there. And I think we often see that with, school people who do these study trips to Finland or they go to Singapore and have a lot of value, but is a completely different context and say, well, if we adopt this, then it'll work, and not taking into full account what it is. And even when you mention that word like product, I've got my own connotations of what a product is, and I'm looking at an end result, whereas opposed to when you think of formative, summative assessment, we're looking at more of a reflective or not seeing a definitive answer. So you're very right in that, I think, as well, where we come from in our understanding of education, what terminology means can be very vast and very different. Now, I think you've probably touched on a bit of this already, but when we look at the word differentiated instruction, and we kind of need to sort of look at it in terms of that the words themselves. For me, the term suggests that for most teachers, they would differentiate learning because that's a skill or requirement of a teacher, because we look at the EITSL standards and that's what we have to do. And that's kind of one of the core values of being a teacher. But as you've mentioned, it's not that straightforward or generalized. And there are multiple structures and layers that require a very deep level of understanding and professional learning. So what are the key aspects of differentiated learning instruction that might help us get into that pathway? What are those key aspects?
Okay, so I mentioned pre-planning. You mentioned knowing your students and knowing them well.
Yes.
I really, that to me is so important. But I think the environment, the classroom environment, and that's one of the key curriculum elements that Tomlinson uses. But she's added a little bit in 2014 to that, and she calls it environment/affect. And I think that affect part, you don't need to do anything to do the affect part of differentiated instruction other than know your students. Yes. So let me give you an example. So I've got a class of 25 students. I have 25 diverse learners in my classroom. One of them does not like to read aloud. Embarrassed, doesn't feel confident. So to set up a classroom environment that is safe for all students, I will make sure in the pre-planning of my lessons to ensure that I don't ask that student to read. And that's what affect is that safe environment where students feel that they know their teacher, they have that reciprocal, respectful relationship with them, and they know that they're not going to be asked or required to do something that they don't feel comfortable doing. Now, that doesn't require a great deal of extra work.
No.
And the environment part of differentiated instruction, to me, is not time-consuming.
No.
But it's high-quality teaching, is ensuring that respectful relationship, safe classroom environment, adjustments in the classroom are made for students who might need an elevated desk or prefer to stand rather than sit. I mean, these don't cost money either.
No.
And if teachers are doing that, they are differentiating for instruction. Very simple.
Yeah, and I've been in a bit of debate recently when I looked at it, these kind of, in the sense of the physical environment, there's a lot of theories go around about, oh, we've got open plan learning, or we've got this and we've got that. And again, contextual, I remember very early, sort of long time ago, in the early, late 90s, I was doing a bit of teaching at a school in a very low socioeconomic area with a lot of high trauma children. And they'd done this kind of open plan teaching space. But it was so detrimental for those children with high trauma because there weren't enough corners. And this open thing was they had no understanding of who was going to be coming in next. And it actually was I would have said a complete disaster. And it looked beautiful and all of these kind of special buildings, but it didn't suit the needs of their students. So their behavior was going through the roof. And, I think we see that as well. And I think we often get, because we don't know enough about our students, we might say, oh, that child's misbehaving, so we'll give them a fidget or we'll give them something. And it really is that core of knowing your students and what benefits them, not going, oh, well, I've seen this done before, so we'll just try. And that's what I do see. And I remember a very young student teacher, well, not a student, graduate teacher, and she taught my son. And I remember going in that first day and, you see all the Instagram influencers on social media and these incredible displays, which are for themselves and for the parents, I often think. But I remember this woman had nothing below the child's eyes. She had the eyesight and then she had a few things, but nothing above. And the sense of calm, I just thought, you've developed this classroom for kids, not for me to come in and go, oh, that's an amazing piece of work. It was fully designed. I thought that was a really good sign of someone who'd understood the brief of what it was. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful segue into that one because it's wonderful. Now, we have a lot of lessons we could have learned from the COVID pandemic, I feel, but it definitely brought new challenges and pushed many educators into a very uncomfortable new environment. I mean, we were considerably luckier than I think other countries that the disruption wasn't as major, but it highlighted that in current times, things like socioeconomics, race, gender, disability play a significant role in the learning of the students. And we saw that those who'd had some of those things taken away from them or those constructs, it really affected their learning. Now, differentiated learning, I would say, is more important than ever to support the needs of all students. What lessons do you think we've learned from the pandemic that could enhance teachers to adapt differentiated instruction practices?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know whether I'm in the best position to answer that, not being a teacher in a classroom myself during the COVID pandemic. but I was a lecturer, and we had
Yes.
to move, like everybody, like classroom teachers too, we had to move to the online learning space. But I'm teaching adults who are more adaptable than young children and adolescents. What I think we did learn from that, just on the off chance I was in a public place towards the end of the year, and there were two teachers that had just gone on holidays, and two primary teachers, and they were sitting side by side, and they were exhausted.
Yes.
Absolutely physically and mentally exhausted with the online learning that occurred, the yes, we're in lockdown, no, we're not in lockdown, just that ever-present not being able to organise your week without knowing what might happen. So there was no predictability, which I think would have been extremely traumatic for teachers and also for students. So I think one of the takeaways could be the importance of that structure in schools, because children love structure.
They do.
They like organisation. They like structure.
Yeah.
They like predictability, and that was taken away from them in that 12 months. So I think that's a really good learning thing. Maybe that schools in particular, but children are so adaptable.
Yes.
That's the wonderful thing too. And they're just like sponges. So, if I'm looking at young children now in 2025. So we're 4 years post the worst of COVID, and we're hearing about it less and less. And I think that's really important too. I think hopefully the majority of young people have now moved on. But I think structure, organisation, and planning, and being able to put your plans into action is something maybe that is so special for teachers and highly regarded by them.
Yeah, and I think that key theme we've been talking about, really about that teacher having really knowing the students. And I suppose in a classroom environment, you can own that responsibility, and you can own really kind of knowing that you're a degree of control of what's going on. But I think what probably most people tried to do in the pandemic was move that learning environment into an online space, which was never going to translate. So, you're a teacher teaching 24 kids. Are you responsible for one of them going off to a toilet or going into like that kind of, we didn't have that environment where we could draw each other's in. And I think, I'm coming from a digital technologies perspective in STEM, and I saw the great benefits of, we're using tech probably, and I've been trying to, push this up a hill for so long, and suddenly the kids were showing us their ability. But it was actually, as you've alluded to, that mental toil on teachers, because we're not as adaptable as children, and our mindset has to change, and we couldn't make the accommodations for every child because that was without our control. So it's a really good point I think you've made there. Now I'm sort of touching on a bit of this because I know you've done a lot of research as well into inclusive education practices, and especially, I know you've had quite a strong commitment to ADHD and understanding that. And I think we're increasingly seeing more students who have specific diagnoses that require a significant level of adjustment, and those who need additional educational support for them, which is very targeted or specific. What advice would you give to maybe a graduate teacher or just any teacher who just is so overwhelmed by all this information they've given, and how do they start to cater for the needs of every individual child?
Well, the first thing I'll say is you cannot personalise the learning for every child. If you have 25 students in your classroom, if you attempt to personalise the learning for all 25 of those students 5 days a week throughout the entire school year, you're going to burn yourself out very quickly. So the key to that is to use a variety of high quality teaching practices and strategies where you are able to cater for the majority of your students. And look, the interesting thing too is if you graduate with a law degree, you are articled to somebody, and you are mentored, and you learn the ropes over a number of years. When our undergraduate pre-service teachers graduate and they start school in their school for the very first day, and they've got their class list, they expected to be experts in that field already after 4 years of university. And I don't doubt that when I started teaching in 1980, that the class in front of me, there were diverse learners, but we didn't know a great deal about the diversity of the learners and the number of conditions that some of those children may or may not have. It wasn't spoken about. Whereas that stigma now is slowly but surely reducing. And it is an expectation by our state government policies. In Queensland, we have an inclusive education policy. We've had that since 2018, that we are catering to the needs of every student in our classroom. And I think that is a huge challenge for teachers. So I think they have to work smarter and build their skills up over time so that they are confident to be able to cater for the needs of every student in their classroom, and high quality teaching strategies and flexible classroom groupings. Also, allowing students to work in pairs independently, using direct instruction where you're teaching the whole class at the time. So, that flexibility in the classroom, I think, is so important, and a wonderful skill to help you to ensure that you are accommodating for every student.
And that sometimes it seems to be like common sense, but it's basic, like tapping into your intuition as well through relationships. What does this child need? And it's very interesting, and we've discussed it before, but I think the teacher now is a master of all trades, or has to take things. And, I always think about, if I go to my GP, I don't expect them to perform heart surgery on me if I need to have heart surgery, or they've got something, they send us in the right direction of somebody who can do that. And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of teachers, all of these specialists are coming in and telling them, you need to do this, you need to do that, which is very rightly so, but it just adds a huge burden, an enormous expectation on them to be accountable for that area of that child's development, which I think is really quite sad. And I think that's what, as you alluded to before, we're seeing so many people burn out. And also there's not that much clarity in the role sometimes. We're just, what are you doing? We talked about this actually with leadership, that clarity of role. So it seems to go further, get up, that seems to be more defined. But as a classroom teacher, that's actually really quite difficult. Now, so we get to the last question, and it's always one of my favorites because people find it really difficult. Actually, it's probably one of the hardest ones I find. But has there been a teacher or someone in your life who's inspired you on the educational journey?
Certainly. There's been a number of them. When I read this question, I thought, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, but I'm going to have to come back to my Year 11 biology teacher, my Year 11 modern history teacher.
Oh, lovely.
Mr. Owen. So, and I'll give you a context of that. So I went to an all-girls school on the northern beaches of Sydney, which was a state school. So for some reason, Sydney decided to have single-sex high schools, the education department, over a number of years. And the school that I went to on the northern beaches is still an all-girls public school. And I had my first male teacher in my entire education for the Year 11. One and only male teacher, who happened to be, we had a teacher shortage in that time, and he came from the USA. And so first male teacher, only took modern history because I had to take an extra subject. It was on the line. I went, okay, I'll do this. And over the 2 years that I had him, my love of history, modern history, went from nil to me receiving in the HSC top 10% of the state. So, and that subject got me the scholarship, got me over that line. And I think his model of teaching was not write this down. He spoke to his students. And I think that's the type of teacher I became too, where, I'm definitely an extrovert. I love teaching adolescents, and I love teaching to my knowledge skills. So I'm not a chalk and talk, as in I'm not teaching out of a textbook. And that's what he did. So he was my favourite teacher, and I modelled my teaching on him.
Oh, it's quite a great way of saying that basically teachers do change lives, don't they? They change your trajectory and they see in you what you probably can't see yourself. And I think that's the most important part of our profession, is to show somebody or show that mirror to them and say, you are capable of doing this and you will go on to do great things. And we just need that champion, don't we? And we hope that we've done that for someone along the way.
Yeah, we actually do. And but the negative side of that was when I applied for the scholarship, my number one choice of teacher was to be a modern history teacher, and number two was primary, and I would have been a terrible primary school teacher. I know that.
Yeah.
And number three was home economics.
Yep.
And that was what I got the scholarship for, because there was a shortage of them. And we had enough history teachers at the time where they didn't need to be giving out scholarships. So I was absolutely devastated. But the light at the end of the tunnel is 3 magical friends that I made at Teachers College are still friends of mine today.
Yeah.
So there you go. That connection to people. So important.
Yeah, and I think you'll find that that's kind of a common story. I've interviewed quite a few people, is that what they ended up going into was the thing that they probably didn't like the most. But that's probably testament to the fact that as educators, we have you alluded before, we are so adaptable. We can do it. And we have the approach to change our mindset. And sometimes what we love is not maybe what our strength is, but we can still enjoy it and love it and have a great thing. I know I love literature and reading, but I'm actually much more on the science spectrum of how I can communicate science better. So I think that is a really, really key thing that we need to have. And as you say, it's the tribe around you. So it's people who champion you and make that experience so much better. Well, thank you, Kathy, for what has been the most wonderful conversation. What a great way to start my morning off, I have to say. And I do hope that listeners will reach out to you and see the work in action. We very much really looking forward to that paper, hopefully at the end of the year, which will showcase that and look at how we can adopt differentiated instructional practices. But thank you again. It has been a wonderful day, and we do hope that our listeners will connect and be part of that differentiated instructional journey. Thank you very much.